September 1973, a 32-year-old typist walks into a quiet Derbyshire cemetery to meet a man. Minutes later, she is battered to death in one of the most savage murders the county has ever witnessed. Within hours, police detain a vulnerable 17-year-old cemetery groundsman with significant learning difficulties. He is quickly convicted of her murder. But decades later, witnesses emerge claiming Wendy Sewell was seen alive with another man after Stephen Downing had already left the cemetery. Anonymous letters name multiple men allegedly at the graveyard that day. So who really murdered Wendy Sewell? Welcome to Crimes That Haunt Us, where the coldest cases are never forgotten. Subscribe now and join us for a new investigation every 2 weeks. Wendy Sewell was born in 1941 and grew up in the city of Sheffield in Yorkshire. Sometime before Wendy's murder, her father sadly passed away, leaving her widowed mother alone. In 1964, Wendy met and married her future husband, David, a scientific officer for British Rail in Derby. Together, they made their home at Green Farm in Middleton by Yorgreave. By 1973, the couple had been married for around 9 years, though their relationship had been marked by repeated separations and reconciliations. They had no children together. Unfortunately, very little information is available about Wendy's early life or her upbringing. Much of what is known today only emerged decades after her death and centers largely on claims that she was highly promiscuous and frequently had affairs in public settings, leading to the cruel media epithet, the Bakewell Tart. The Sewells' marriage remained troubled. During one period of separation, Wendy gave birth to a son on the 3rd of September 1968, who was later adopted. In the years that followed, at least 3 local men claimed they could have been the child's father. By the time of her death, however, Wendy and David were once again living together under the same roof. Wendy worked as a typist and legal secretary for the Forestry Commission on King Street in Bakewell. Within the small market town, she was well known for her extramarital relationships. Locals would later recall that, after her husband left for work each morning, Wendy would sometimes leave the porch light on as a signal that the coast was clear. According to memories shared by locals years later, during one of the couple's separations, Wendy rented a room above a wool shop where she met men until she was eventually asked to leave. She also regularly took extended lunch breaks and was said to meet boyfriends in secluded outdoor locations, including the Bakewell Cemetery. Colleagues later recalled that on the morning of her death, Wendy had spoken about an argument the previous evening with a current boyfriend. The murder of Wendy Sewell would soon become forever intertwined with the life of a teenage boy from the same village. Stephen Leslie Downing was born at home in Bakewell on the 4th of March 1956. His parents were Ray, a former RAF serviceman who later worked in the ambulance service and then as a taxi driver, and his mother, Juanita, known as Nita. He had a younger sister, Christine, known as Chrissy, who was born exactly 3 years later. The family initially lived at Burton Edge before moving to Holywell Flats, and later to 24 Stanton View in Bakewell when Stephen was 11 years old. At school, Stephen struggled academically. He achieved below-average results, had significant learning difficulties, and his reading age was assessed at around 11 years old. He was also described as having a very low IQ and was deeply embarrassed by his poor reading and spelling abilities. Despite this, locals remembered him as a gentle, naive young man who had never had a girlfriend, kept pet hedgehogs in the garden shed, and worked as a council gardener and groundsman at Bakewell Cemetery. At the time of Wendy's murder, he had only been in the job for around 3 weeks. The full extent of Stephen's learning difficulties would not become widely known until decades after he had been imprisoned. On the 12th of September 1973, the little picturesque village of Bakewell would become forever haunted by a vicious and brutal unsolved murder. 17-year-old Stephen Downing arrived at the cemetery for his usual shift, carrying out his routine duties with nothing out of the ordinary to mark the morning. Meanwhile, 32-year-old Wendy Sewell had arrived at the Forestry Commission offices on King Street and was working away as normal. At around 12 p.m., Wendy received either a phone call or a visit to the office. Her boss, who was on the telephone in another room, later recalled hearing raised voices before Wendy briefly came in with a note telling him she was nipping out for lunch. Nothing appeared unusual. At 12:30 p.m., Wendy was seen walking through Bakewell towards the cemetery on Butts Road by a friend who encountered her hurrying up the hill. The friend later said that Wendy seemed excited and indicated that she was on her way to meet a boyfriend so the pair could make up after an argument. Then, at approximately 12:50 p.m., a witness named Charles Carman, who knew Wendy by sight, saw her entering Bakewell Cemetery. There was nothing alarming or suspicious about the sighting, certainly nothing to suggest the horror that was about to unfold. Sometime just after 1 p.m., Stephen Downing stoked the fire in the chapel, then slung his coat over his shoulders and left for home to feed the 2 baby hedgehogs he had rescued a fortnight earlier before having lunch with his mother. As he had walked out of the cemetery, he had noticed Wendy Sewell near the chapel in the Garden of Remembrance but had thought nothing of it. 5 separate witnesses saw Stephen leaving the cemetery around this time, walking with his characteristic, unhurried, shambling gait. Once home, he fed the 2 baby hedgehogs with a syringe filled with milk, boiled the kettle, and changed his boots in the garage. By the time his mother arrived a few minutes later, he was already there, and the 2 shared a brief lunch together. Before leaving, Stephen asked his mother to buy him some more soda for later, along with a better syringe for feeding the hedgehogs. At around 1:20 p.m., Stephen said goodbye, left home, and headed back to work. As he arrived through the cemetery, he waved to the man in the gatehouse before making his way back towards the shed. At approximately 1:25 p.m., Stephen discovered Wendy, bloodied and wearing only her jumper. Her trousers and undergarments lay strewn across the footpath and a nearby gravestone, while she appeared to have sustained obvious head injuries. Stephen decides to check Wendy for a heartbeat. In doing so, she reacts violently, jerking her head backwards, her hair flicking blood across his clothing. Panicking, Stephen sprints back to the gate lodge, hammering on the door and shouting that a woman had been attacked. His return coincided with the arrival of 3 workmen who accompanied him back to where he had found Wendy. She was still alive and, as they approached, struggled to her feet before stumbling around. The men watched as she tripped and fell, striking her head hard against a gravestone. One of the workers quickly summons police. They then arrive on the scene. It is said that Stephen immediately approached one of the officers and exclaimed, "It wasn't me, honest," before explaining how he had come across the badly injured Wendy. The first police constable did not immediately call for an ambulance, allowing Wendy to move around before she eventually collapsed again. For reasons that remain unclear, it would be a harrowing 40 minutes before paramedics finally arrived at the cemetery. When they did, Wendy violently resisted their attempts to help her, shaking and repeatedly shouting "No, no, no" as they bundled her into the back of the ambulance. A police officer later described her condition as semi-conscious. She was then rushed to Chesterfield Royal Hospital. By the time Wendy reached the hospital, she had lost consciousness. Because she was still alive when emergency services arrived, there was no immediate large-scale preservation of the scene in the way there would have been during a confirmed murder investigation. Nonetheless, detectives and forensic officers immediately began collating evidence at the scene. Also present was the bloodied pickaxe handle. Wendy's clothing lay strewn across the pathway close to where she had been found, while her handbag appeared to be missing. Police immediately began searching for witnesses, knocking on nearby houses as a team of sniffer dogs was brought in to assist. Wendy was soon identified, prompting detectives to visit her husband, David. As is routine in cases of this nature, he was examined extensively, questioned at length, and his alibi carefully checked. Police appeared to have ruled him out quickly. Following Wendy's death, David was again questioned and his movements re-examined, but he is ultimately eliminated from the inquiry. Stephen Downing, meanwhile, was immediately taken in for questioning. Police insisted he was only helping them with their inquiries, meaning he was neither cautioned nor provided with a solicitor. Downstairs, his father arrived on 6 separate occasions to collect his son, only to be lured away each time. At first, Stephen remained firm in his accounts of the events. He told detectives that he had seen Wendy walking through the cemetery as he left for lunch but paid her little attention. On returning to work at around 1:25 p.m., he claimed he found Wendy lying half-naked, sprawled across the pathway and a gravestone. He said he had gone to check for a heartbeat when Wendy suddenly began thrashing around violently. The blood splatter on his clothing he would only come to learn about much later on. The sudden movement, he claimed, caused him to lose his balance and fall backwards against the gravestone before Wendy herself collapsed back to the ground. Stephen then told detectives that he felt a hand on his back as someone warned him, "Don't move. We will say that you did it. Remember, the same will happen to your sister." He then recalled hearing either "Have you got it?" or "Have you found it?" Moments later, he hears rustling behind him. As he turned, he claimed to see a man making his way down into the trees with a denim jacket pulled over his head, wearing a lemon-colored t-shirt. Stephen said he then ran to fetch his colleagues who, after seeing Wendy's condition, had summoned both police and an ambulance. But by 1:30 a.m. into the following early morning, Stephen Downing is alleged to have then confessed. After around 9 hours of continuous questioning, police claimed he admitted assaulting Wendy with the butt of a pickaxe, striking her twice on the back of the neck before sexually assaulting her. However, a post-mortem examination would later establish that Wendy had actually suffered between 7 to 8 blows to the skull, leaving it fractured, findings that completely contradicted Stephen's alleged account of striking her twice in the back of the neck. It also emerged that there was no evidence of any sexual assault, despite the confession stating that he had molested her. Police then produced a confession, handwritten in pencil and containing numerous words Stephen did not understand. It stated that he had murdered Wendy Sewell and sexually assaulted her between 12:50 p.m. and 1:08 p.m. Detectives eventually persuaded him to sign the statement in ink. Stephen Downing was then charged with the grievous assault of Wendy Sewell, who remained critically ill in the intensive care unit at Chesterfield Royal Hospital. On the 14th of September, Wendy Sewell died at Chesterfield Royal Hospital from the devastating head injury she had suffered just 2 days earlier. She never did regain consciousness and was never able to identify her attacker to police. Later that same day, 17-year-old Stephen Leslie Downing is then formally charged with Wendy Sewell's murder. He was remanded into custody at Risley Remand Centre. But just 13 days later, September 27th, Stephen is said to have broken down in tears while in custody and retracted his confession vehemently. By then, however, the wheels of justice had already been set in motion, and he remained behind bars until his trial in February 1974. The post-mortem examination of Wendy Sewell began immediately. It established that she had died from severe head injuries. The pathologist found that she had been struck around the head multiple times, commonly reported as 7 or 7 to 8 blows with a pickaxe handle, causing extensive fractures to her skull. It is also determined that the attacker was right-handed. This detail would become significant decades later because Stephen Downing was a known left-hander. Wendy's lower clothing, her trousers, pants and plimsoll, had been removed, along with parts of her bra. Her pantyhose and handbag remained missing and have never been recovered. A pathology report dated 14th of September 1973, the day Wendy died, also recorded additional findings that would attract attention decades after the trial. It noted massive ecchymoses in the mucous membrane below the level of the false vocal cords and deep bruising to the neck cervical muscles, indicating the possibility of strangulation. The report further stated that some of her injuries may have resulted from kicking with heavy boots. Journalist Don Hale would later theorize that Wendy's missing pantyhose may have been used to garrote her. Months after the murder, 16-year-old waitress Jane Elizabeth Atkins, a teenager from Bakewell, decided she needed to come forward and tell police about a contradictory sighting she had made in the cemetery while searching for her dog on the afternoon Wendy was murdered. Jane claimed that sometime between 1:10 p.m. and 1:30 p.m. she saw a woman matching Wendy's description with her arms around another man whom she believed to be her boyfriend amongst the gravestones shortly before Wendy was killed. She was adamant that the man was not Stephen Downing. This boyfriend was later claimed to have been a prominent Bakewell businessman. Jane had seen Downing leaving the cemetery shortly before seeing Wendy and the unidentified man. She recognized Stephen because of his distinctive gait. The sighting would later become significant during the appeals process because it placed Wendy alive and with another man after the time Stephen Downing was alleged to have killed her. Jane told the police she had initially been too frightened to come forward because she feared the man she had seen with Wendy might have recognized her. However, it is said that police dismissed her statement. On February 13, 1974, the trial of Stephen Downing began at Nottingham Crown Court, where he entered a plea of not guilty. The prosecution's case rested primarily on Downing's alleged confessions, while the defense would argue forcefully that they had been coerced and were entirely untrue. The trial itself would last just 2 days. The prosecution opened by reading Stephen's alleged confession, in which he was said to have stated during the night of his detention, "I did it, but I don't know what made me do it," before breaking down in tears. "I haven't talked to her and she hadn't talked to me. I think she knew I was there." The prosecution alleged that Downing told police he had struck Wendy twice to the back of the neck with the pickaxe handle he had been using earlier that day while cutting wood. It was then said that he told officers he rolled Wendy over and began removing her clothing, stating, "I knew I had to knock her out before I did anything." During the trial, however, Stephen Downing would emphatically deny that his admissions during police interviews were true, insisting they had been coerced. He claimed he had only admitted to the murder because he was exhausted, hungry, and suffering from back pain caused by a spinal abscess. The interviews, he said, had continued for 9 hours without respite. According to Stephen, the questioning was relentless. He claimed officers repeatedly woke him by shoving his shoulder, telling him the interviews would continue all night and for as long as necessary. He also alleged that detectives repeatedly told him to admit it because "we know you did it." Although Downing denied murdering Wendy, he admitted in court that he had indecently assaulted her by touching her breast and vagina before checking for a heartbeat as she lay sprawled across a gravestone. When asked why, he simply replied, "I just thought now was as good a time as any," explaining that he had never touched a girl before. There were also a number of forensic oddities in the case that appeared difficult to reconcile with the prosecution's version of events. Downing admitted that he returned to the unconsecrated chapel to collect his coat and bottle before leaving through the main gate, where 5 witnesses described him as appearing calm and composed with no obvious signs of bloodstaining, something you would have expected him to be covered in had he been the man to bludgeon Wendy Sewell. Years after the trial, advances in forensic testing detected slight bloodstaining on his coat. However, according to Stephen's own account, he had not been wearing that coat at the time. Furthermore, no bloodstaining was found on the blue boots he said he had been wearing when he discovered Wendy. The pickaxe handle used as the murder weapon was also not one of those stamped by Bakewell Urban District Council, whose records showed they still had a full tally of their own tools. Downing had also admitted to changing out of his blue dress boots during his lunch break. Therefore, if he had committed the murder at the prosecution's stated time, the bloodstaining would have been expected on a different pair of boots. Forensic evidence also appeared to support Stephen's claim that he had merely found Wendy and turned her body over. In his scientific evidence, Dr. Norman Lee stated, "The bloodstaining on the clothing, some of it is consistent with someone turning over the body." However, he also queried other blood spatter, suggesting it may have been caused by Miss Sewell flinging herself about with considerable force. This was again supported by statements from PC Ball and ambulanceman Bateman. PC Ball stated that she resisted violently with her arms. Meanwhile, Mr. Bateman said, "Miss Sewell was still alive and she tried to put away those who were trying to look after her. She became very restless, moving about a lot, throwing out her right arm, and my uniform was covered with blood." A laboratory report prepared by commercial and forensic laboratories also stated that the condition of the pickaxe handle was inconsistent with Downing's original and later retracted confession, but consistent with the known facts of the forensic attack. Stephen Downing also batted left-handed, while the injuries to Wendy were said to have been inflicted by a right-handed attacker. Other reports connected with the case are also worthy of note. Reports of a blood-stained man running away along Yeld Road, and claims that police received misleading statements from key witnesses. Of the 4 key witnesses identified near the murder scene who could potentially have helped establish Downing's innocence, 1 allegedly told a pack of lies, 2 others claimed they had been miles away despite being seen in the area, and the 4th was apparently never interviewed. In his summing up, the trial judge reminded the jury of the defense's allegations of police coercion. He told them that if they believed Stephen had indeed been denied adequate food and rest, then such treatment would amount to oppression. If they concluded that oppression had occurred, then the statements obtained from him would be worthless. February 15th, Stephen Leslie Downing was convicted of the murder of Wendy Sewell after the jury deliberated for just 1 hour. He was immediately taken into custody and sentenced to life imprisonment. Despite the verdict, Stephen remained steadfast in maintaining his innocence. His parents and sister also stood firmly by his side, and he immediately launched an appeal against that conviction. On the 25th of October 1974, 3 Court of Appeal judges in London dismissed Stephen Downing's application to appeal his conviction. During the hearing, defense counsel called upon 16-year-old Jane Elizabeth Atkins, who told the judges she had definitely seen Stephen Downing leaving the cemetery before noticing Wendy Sewell in the arms of a completely different man. She stated that this sequence of events definitely occurred between 1:10 and 1:30 p.m., which, according to Stephen Swan's statement, was after the prosecution alleged Wendy had already been killed. The prosecution argued that Jane had simply mistaken the day. However, the defense pointed out that it had been the first day she was back at school in her uniform. Stephen had been off work sick on the Monday and Tuesday. He had returned to work on the Wednesday, the day Wendy was murdered. The following day, he was in prison and had remained there ever since, so it had to have been the Wednesday when Jane was in her school uniform. According to the defense, this information had been available during the original trial but had again been dismissed. But the appeal judges noted that police had visited Jane's house during their initial door-to-door inquiries, where she had said she knew nothing about the case. They concluded that this undermined the credibility of her later evidence. A Mr. and Miss Walker, who lived at the cemetery gatehouse, together with Peter Moran, all testified that they had seen Stephen leaving the cemetery looking calm and composed. In contrast, defense witness Mary Hadfield claimed she had seen a tall, fair-haired man fleeing the cemetery down Yeld Road around the time of the murder. She described bloodstaining on his left leg that resembled a horseshoe in shape. Another witness, George Paling, told the court that around the same time he had been out with his grandchildren when he saw a man sprinting away, stopping briefly to catch his breath. The man then continued running across the playing fields of Lady Manners School, which is adjacent to the graveyard. But despite these submissions, the judges dismissed Stephen Downing's appeal against conviction and refused him any further right of appeal. In 1979, 6 years after the murder, police learned that Wendy Sewell's then-boyfriend at the time had lied and provided a false alibi to police. Back in 1973, he had told detectives he was not in Bakewell when Wendy was murdered, claiming instead that he had been attending a sheep sale in Wales. Seemingly, however, this revelation was either dismissed or simply ignored by police. The information would only come to light decades later when Don Hale, editor of the Matlock Mercury, began investigating the case. On the 31st of July 1980, the Derby Daily Telegraph published an article reporting that the Downing family were petitioning the Home Secretary to release their son from Wakefield Prison, citing what they believed to be a number of damning discrepancies in the case against him. With the help of a private investigator, they pointed out that Stephen's reading age was that of an 11-year-old, yet his so-called written confession contained numerous sophisticated words that they argued he would neither have understood nor been capable of writing. They also highlighted that Stephen's limited mental capacity had never been presented during his trial. Despite their relentless efforts behind the scenes, Stephen continued to languish behind bars as the years passed. In November 1994, a mysterious woman who had recently returned to Bakewell telephoned the Downings' home, saying she was shocked that Stephen was still in prison for a crime he did not commit. She told Stephen's parents that she had sent incriminating evidence to both the Sheffield Star and the Matlock Mercury in August 1994, evidence which allegedly supported Stephen's long-standing claims of innocence. At the beginning of 1995, Stephen's desperate parents turned to Don Hale, editor of the Matlock Mercury, pleading for help. After being contacted by the Downings, Hale began his investigation by knocking on the doors of houses overlooking the cemetery. Almost immediately, he struck gold. An elderly woman welcomed him inside, saying, "I'm so glad someone is finally doing something about this." She told Hale that she had seen a van parked outside the cemetery at the time of the murder, with two men behaving in what she considered to be a suspicious manner. She had written down both the vehicle's registration number and descriptions of the two men on the back of a cigarette packet before taking it to local police, where she claimed she was simply told to go away. Hale asked whether she still had the note she had made on the day of the murder. Astonishingly, she opened a closet drawer and produced the very same cigarette packet. It was beyond belief. 22 years she had kept that box, Hale later recalled. It was yellowed and dusty, but still completely legible and damning to the police case. Hale had the registration number traced and discovered it belonged to another man known to Wendy Sewell, the very man she was allegedly on her way to meet that afternoon in the cemetery. As Don Hale's investigation gathered momentum, the backlash, according to him, became increasingly sinister. He later claimed he narrowly escaped being deliberately run down by a car on 2 separate occasions before receiving a chilling telephone call warning him it was his last chance and that if he did not abandon the investigation, he had another couple of weeks to live. The threats allegedly escalated even further when, he said, 2 lorries pursued him at high speed, repeatedly ramming the rear of his car and forcing him to flee across open fields to escape. Fearing for his safety, Hale and his wife moved home, went ex-directory, and were even advised by police to use a mirror attached to a stick to check beneath his car for explosive devices. Despite repeated death threats and what he believed were attempts on his life, Hale refused to abandon his campaign to uncover the truth behind Wendy Sewell's murder and Stephen Downing's conviction. On February 3, 1995, the Matlock Mercury published a prominent article raising the possibility that Stephen Downing could, in fact, be innocent. The article noted that, by this stage, Stephen had spent more than 2 decades vehemently denying the murder and remained determined to clear his name. It also pointed out that if Stephen had simply admitted responsibility after serving 22 years already, he would likely have been released 6 years earlier, back in 1989. The article highlighted witness evidence that had been dismissed. Evidence which suggested not only that Stephen was not present in the cemetery at the time of the murder, but also that several witnesses had reported seeing Wendy with a possible boyfriend there. Another witness claimed a suspicious-looking man, possibly accompanied by a Jack Russell dog, had been loitering around the cemetery for up to an hour before the attack. The article also made another significant claim, that Wendy Sewell had arranged a meeting man there for a sexual rendezvous. On February 4th, Stephen Downing himself gave an exclusive interview to the Matlock Mercury, claiming he had only admitted to the crime during police questioning because he feared for his younger sister's safety. Threats from the 2 men stood behind him in the cemetery. He said he decided to take the blame after first being assaulted by an unnamed individual following the discovery of Wendy's body. According to Stephen, it was fear for his sister that ultimately led him to confess. On the 9th of February, the Matlock Mercury editor Don Hale published another article revealing that he was in possession of an anonymous letter from someone who claimed to have been present in the cemetery on the day of the murder. Hale argued that the letter was genuine because it contained information that, he believed, could only have been known by somebody present that day. He publicly urged the anonymous writer to come forward to help clear Stephen Downing's name. Then, on February 17, further revelations emerged concerning DNA and forensic discrepancies in the Wendy Sewell case. It was reported that Stephen Downing's fingerprints had not been found on the bloodied pickaxe handle and that fingernail scrapings taken from Wendy did not match Stephen, who by then had served 22 years of his life sentence. It was also claimed that this information had not been made available to the defense during the original 1973 trial. It also became public knowledge that there had been reports of a tall, fair-haired, athletically built man running away from the cemetery along Yeld Road wearing a blood-stained t-shirt. As he fled, he was reportedly heard asking himself, "What have I done?" The witness later claimed police showed little interest in the account, even when the witness attempted to give officers the fleeing man's actual name. It is understood that this man has never been interviewed by police to date. It was further reported that the anonymous letter identified 3 men who had allegedly met Wendy in the cemetery after Stephen Downing had left the grounds. The letter went on to allege that one of those 3 men regularly met Wendy there. The article concluded by stating that the police were now considering new DNA techniques to test the 3 new suspects against the evidence collected in 1973. On February 24, 1995, the Matchlock Mercury received another anonymous letter believed to have been written by the same author. In it, the writer named additional people who had been present that day as potential witnesses. The letter also confirmed that Stephen Downing had left the cemetery during the period in which the attack took place. Perhaps most damningly, the author claimed that the pickaxe handle used in the attack was not a council-owned tool at all, but had instead been taken from the van of one of 3 men identified in the earlier letter. This appeared to coincide with evidence given by the council during the original trial, which stated that all of their pickaxe handles had fully been accounted for. It was also publicly revealed that editor Don Hale had begun receiving death threats, as had Stephen Downing's parents and a family friend. Police now reportedly conceded that if the anonymous letter writer were to come forward, Stephen Downing would likely be freed immediately. Yet despite growing support outside prison, Stephen remained incarcerated. His parole applications continued to be rejected, primarily because he refused to admit murdering Wendy Sewell. During his investigation, Don Hale focused on a small group of local Bakewell men whom he believed were connected to the murder. He referred to them only by the aliases Mr. Blue, Mr. Orange, and Mr. Red. Hale said he knew the identity of Mr. Blue but could not prove his guilt, which was why he used an alias. Mr. Orange was an ex-convict and was placed at the cemetery by multiple witnesses. Mr. Red, described by Hale as a powerful local figure and former lover of Wendy's, was alleged to have pressured others into providing him with false alibis. Hale described him as a thug and a bully who went to an awful lot of trouble to threaten people into giving him false alibis. Both Mr. Red and Mr. Orange were reported to have been among Wendy's former lovers. One of Hale's most striking claims was that Mr. Red had also been questioned 3 years earlier in connection with the 1970 murder of Barbara Mayo, whose body was discovered near Old Hocknell, around 12 miles from Bakewell. Hale also drew comparisons with the unsolved 1970 murder of the hitchhiker Jacqueline Ansel Lamb in Cheshire, arguing that all 3 killings shared common features, including strangulation, blows to the head, and sexual assault. He maintained that Wendy possessed potentially damaging knowledge about several prominent local men and believed the most likely motive for her murder was either an argument with a lover or an attempt to silence her. Despite his years of investigative work, Don Hale's findings appeared to remain dismissed by police, who believed they already had the right man. Meanwhile, Stephen Downing continued to deny murdering Wendy Sewell and was continued to be refused parole. In September 1997, news then breaks that Derbyshire police had reopened the murder investigation into teacher Barbara Mayo, who had been murdered in 1970 after her body was discovered at Old Hocknell, Derbyshire, following the discovery of a fingerprint believed to belong to her killer found on an item of her clothing. The breakthrough had been made possible by a revolutionary fingerprint enhancement technique developed by Derbyshire police, which detectives also intended to apply to the unsolved murders of Wendy Sewell and Jackie Ansel Lamb. The victims were of similar age and appearance. Both Mayo and Sewell's handbags and other personal identifying items had disappeared. The murders occurred within the same broad geographical region, and all 3 investigations had been plagued by anonymous letters and telephone calls. Both Mayo and Sewell were found laying spread-eagled in a star shape. Lamb and Mayo had both been kicked, punched and strangled, whereas Wendy had been kicked, bludgeoned and potentially strangled as well. Perhaps most intriguingly, the article revealed that two of Wendy Sewell's male associates, together with two of their friends and another Bakewell man, had already been questioned during the Barbara Mayo investigation, a remarkable connection that has rarely been discussed outside of Don Hale's earlier findings. One of those men was a lorry driver who was purportedly the prime suspect in the Mayo case and was known for picking up hitchhikers. The other was a van driver. Both men had also been questioned during the Wendy Sewell investigation. But despite these apparent connections, Derbyshire police ultimately ruled out any link between the cases, and that particular line of inquiry came to an end. In July 1999, an application was then submitted to the newly established Criminal Cases Review Commission. The CCRC investigated both the reliability of Stephen Downing's confession and the forensic blood evidence. In November 2000, the commission formally referred the conviction back to the Court of Appeal. Then, on February 7, 2001, after spending 27 years in prison, Stephen Downing was released on bail from Little Hay Prison in Cambridgeshire, pending the full appeal hearing. Then, on January 15, 2002, the Court of Appeal quashed Stephen Downing's murder conviction, ruling that it was unsafe. The judges found that police had committed substantial and significant breaches of the judge's rules by questioning the 17-year-old for many hours without cautioning him as a suspect and without allowing him access to a solicitor. The confession, which had formed the central plank of the prosecution's case, was therefore deemed unreliable. Fresh forensic evidence also challenged the original interpretation of the bloodstaining found on Downing's clothing. The court did not declare Stephen factually innocent, but his conviction was formally overturned. Following the decision, Downing received an interim compensation payout of £250,000 from the Home Office, followed by a final undisclosed settlement reported to have been less than £500,000. Derbyshire police then launched a full re-investigation under the name Operation Noble. During 2002, officers interviewed approximately 1,600 people at an estimated cost of £500,000. 22 alternative suspects, many of them previously identified during Don Hale's campaign and his later book, were investigated and ultimately eliminated. One of those individuals was Stephen's own father. At the conclusion of the inquiry, police stated that Stephen Downing remained the only person they had been unable to eliminate. That same year, Stephen Downing was alleged to have made 3 separate confessions to Wendy Sewell's murder. One was secretly recorded during an argument by a woman he was in a relationship with, Christine Smith. Police also alleged that he confessed to his father, Ray, on 2 separate occasions that same year. During the Operation Noble reinvestigation, Derbyshire police sought to question Stephen about these alleged admissions, but he declined to be interviewed. Downing has consistently denied that any of them were genuine confessions, maintaining that one was simply a sarcastic repetition of accusations being made towards him, and insisting that he has never admitted responsibility for Wendy Sewell's murder. In February 2003, Derbyshire police then announced that the case was closed and that they were not looking for anyone else unless substantial new evidence emerged. In February and March of 2004, the BBC broadcast a 2-part drama entitled In Denial of Murder, starring Stephen Tompkinson as Don Hale, Jason Watkins as Stephen Downing, and Caroline Katz as Wendy Sewell. Based on Hale's book, Town Without Pity, the drama intercut the campaign to free Downing with flashbacks to the events of 1973. It adopted a more ambiguous stance than Hale's own campaign, incorporating both the findings of Operation Noble and the alleged post-release confessions. Don Hale himself criticized the production, arguing that it contained inaccuracies, altered the timeline without justification, omitted key elements, and presented a distorted version of events. The BBC rejected these claims. In early March 2004, just days before the second part of the BBC drama was due to air, Stephen Downing was arrested by Derbyshire police on suspicion of intimidating a female witness. He was interviewed and released on bail while the Crown Prosecution Service considered the allegation. The matter related to a witness in a separate case involving Stephen's father, Ray Downing, who, in December 2003, had been sentenced to 8 months imprisonment after being convicted of indecently assaulting a 17-year-old girl. No further public action appears to have been taken against Stephen in connection with this allegation. Today, the murder of Wendy Sewell officially remains unsolved. Stephen Downing has never been recharged and has always maintained his complete innocence. He continues to live in the Bakewell area. Derbyshire police have never altered their position that Stephen Downing is the only person they have been unable to eliminate from the inquiry. No other individual has ever been charged or publicly identified as a suspect since the conclusion of Operation Noble in 2003. As with so many historic murder cases, the passing of time has often reduced Wendy Sewell to little more than a collection of headlines, rumors, and unflattering labels. The truth is that we know remarkably little about the woman herself beyond the fragments preserved in newspaper archives and court records. Whatever her private life may or may not have been, it should never define how she is remembered. Wendy Sewell was first and foremost a daughter, a wife, and above all, the victim of a savage and brutal attack that has never been conclusively solved. More than half a century later, her family were denied the certainty of knowing who killed her, while the questions surrounding Stephen Downing's conviction continue to divide opinion to this day. And until those questions can finally be answered, Wendy Sewell's murder remains one of Britain's most troubling and enduring unsolved cases. Thank you for watching and listening to Wendy's story. Please feel free to add your own thoughts, comments, and theories down below, and we'll see you next time.